So Thabo Bester is back at Mangaung prison where he escaped last year. Bitter irony there. He says he doesn't feel safe at the facility and is refusing to eat the prison food, fearing he might be poisoned. Ruth Hopkins is an investigative journalist who has written extensively on the prison for several years. She joins us now to share some insights on her research and writing. Ruth, your book is behind you there, The Misery Merchants. Just how much money are these companies making out of privatizing misery in South African prisons?
Well, I believe the two private prison contracts in South Africa for the G4S-run prison Mangaung and for Kutama Sintumele in Limpopo cost the South African state about R1 billion a month. So they're extremely expensive. Way more expensive than the state-run prisons, I'd say.
So extremely expensive and, by the looks of it, not particularly effective. We have someone who's outwitted and outplayed privatized prison in South Africa. I understand that you have been studying Mangaung, which opened in 2001. Did anything about the Thabo Bester story surprise you, or is it really just a kind of staggering case study on how bad things are at Mangaung?
Well, I'd never come across an escape that was this sort of sensational and spectacular and insane, to be honest. But what doesn't surprise me is the corruption and collusion required to pull this off. I think DCS, G4S, and the SAPS, that I've documented that in my book, Misery Merchants, they've been colluding together for decades, really, to cover up for this hellhole of a prison.
Now, we heard our Justice Minister talking about no intent to renew the contract. Do you think there's any argument for taking more decisive action sooner in light of what you've learned about what happens in these prisons? I know you've had access to leaked footage. You've learned about the dynamics between inmates and officials in your work.
Yeah. Well, definitely. I mean, I just think it's outrageous that the contract hasn't been terminated. And the minister did indeed say that they won't extend it beyond 2026. But G4S itself has already declared that, I think, 2 years ago, that they don't want to extend it beyond 2026. And G4S has honestly violated every law in the book. And this is the second time that the prison is taken over by DCS. Following my investigation in 2013, DCS stepped in, temporarily took over. And G4S was also running a prison in the UK, in Birmingham, that similarly also experienced a lot of riots, violence, chaos. The UK government stepped in, terminated the contract, and made it into a state-run prison. And that's what should happen. And I can just hear the minister speak about how much it would cost and money. But can we also talk about the human rights that have been violated, the lives that have been ruined, the corruption, the widespread corruption that's taken place? I think it's shameful that the contract still hasn't been terminated, to be honest.
Prudent that you've raised human rights. Thabo Bester in court today, though he did not address the judge directly, through his lawyer raising concerns about his safety in prison. I did say there is a bitter irony there because, of course, it was some of the weaknesses at the prison which allowed him to escape and leave a body in his absence. But on your own experience and based on your research, what are the kinds of risks that inmates do face? While they are convicted criminals, they are also entitled to rights and protections in terms of the South African Constitution.
Yeah, well, what I uncovered in Mangaung prison from when my research started in 2012 is that the prisoners were being subjected to torture through the use of electroshocking. They were getting beaten up, sometimes into a coma. They were also getting tortured to death, and it was being covered up. And there were forced injections with antipsychotic drugs taking place, used as a form of cheap crowd control. And on top of that, also the guards, the G4S employees at the prison, were also not treated well. They were overworked, underpaid. Nobody listened to their complaints. They were put in very dangerous situations. They were stabbed. They've been attacked, and G4S just did nothing. All they did was make sure that the profits continued. They continued to make money off this contract, and that should really be addressed.
So is there ground to Bester's concerns here? For example, his anxiety that he may be poisoned and that for the time being, at least according to his lawyer, he's not eating?
That I don't know. I mean, he's in Kgosi-Mampuru prison, I think. I don't know if there currently is concerns around the quality of the food. I do know that in general, prisoners in South Africa, they have to survive in very difficult conditions. I mean, a lot of state-run prisons are very overcrowded. It's very scarce healthcare. There's a lot of gang violence. So yes, there are definitely reasons to fear for one's well-being.
You've spoken about the role of G4S. Of course, we had our own version of a kind of G4S involved in correctional services before it completely unraveled, and that was Bosasa. And so, this kind of privatization of prison services, big business, clearly, if we go back to the figure you mentioned at the start, but also incredibly fraught. And if the state isn't capacitated to be able to run prisons to best standard, local or international, we're stuck in a real muddle in terms of how to ensure that inmates are kept safe from one another and from the outside world, but also to do their time, because our correctional services ideology is that people can correct their conduct and then rejoin society. Is this all just a pipe dream?
Well, yes. I'm not sure if it's a pipe dream, but I think that there is definitely a problem in South Africa in terms of its incarceration system. South African prisons are not well run. They're very dilapidated. They struggle with corruption, with violence, with gang violence. Torture also happens in state-run prison. However, I think in an environment like that, if you attach a profit incentive to the incarceration of individuals, then inmates become a commercial entity, and then you actually create a commercial motive to keep crime rates high. That's the last thing South Africa needs, to make a profit off crime, because that basically keeps crime alive.
Interesting you raise that. We are having a conversation later on Newzroom Afrika channel 405 about paid-for killings and that kind of surging industry as well. I just want to ask you a last question, please, around the global phenomenon of privatizing security and the perils that come with that. You've described one of them, which is that it goes completely against the idea of actually quashing criminal activity, because then there's no one to put in your prisons. But what are some of the other sort of parallels you see between what's happening in South Africa, as weird and bizarre as some of the nuances are, and global trends around turning an industrial complex out of security issues?
Well, it's a booming business, the private security sector, and it's growing. And if you look, I mean, the private security sector is private security guards guarding buildings, private prisons, but also private soldiers, so commercialized warfare. And I think it's all problematic. And if you look at the issue of private prisons, and if you look just at G4S, which is a global company, I started an international network of investigative journalists who all looked into G4S, the private security network. And if you look at their work, this company has a terrible track record worldwide and has violated human rights and exploited people in various countries, Nigeria, Kenya, India, Colombia. Yet it is the biggest private security contractor in the world and lands contract after contract after contract. It makes huge profitable revenues, but is never really held accountable and keeps profiting off crime. And I think that's really problematic.
Sure is, in terms of what we've just seen in South Africa. Ruth, just lastly before you go, I know that one of your frustrations, at least as I read about it on Twitter, was that you've been looking at this Mangaung prison for a while and in depth. And of course, this Thabo Bester story has kind of pointed the spotlight on its weaknesses to the point where we're hearing about it in Parliament, and there is some attempt at accountability. Is there anything else you think that is missing from the broader discussion around the prison and Thabo Bester that you'd just like to highlight before you go?
Well, I find now the media is very focused on Thabo Bester and comparing it to a film script and Bonnie and Clyde. But I think it's important to look at the systemic nature of privatized prisons in South Africa, the corruption, the collusion, the human rights violations that I just flagged. I think that is really something that South African society needs to think about. Do they really want this? Is this really contributing to a fairer, just society? Or is it actually just driving up crime rates, driving up crime, driving up human rights violations? And is it not really a very desirable thing to have in society? So I really hope that those issues will be analyzed and scrutinized.
Certainly makes me think how far we're also getting from the principles of correctional services with its emphasis on correction. Ruth Hopkins, investigative journalist there, great points, and thank you very much for your time and your work.